Hi, I'm Dr. Ron Tykoski of the Perot Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, Texas. I've been asked to talk a little bit today about Alaskan dinosaurs. Well, it turns out we've been doing a lot of research on Alaskan dinosaurs here at the Perot for about 15 years or more. And so we have quite a large collection of pieces from across the state. Now, there are a lot of things, a lot of different places around Alaska where you actually find dinosaur fossils, either body fossils or tracks and traces. But given that right now, this little session, this DinoFest, is talking about polar dinosaurs, I'm going to concentrate on those that are actually from the polar regions of Alaska, meaning above the Arctic Circle. There are lots of dinosaur track sites like down in Denali National Park and Nanuqsaurus, down in those areas. Tons and tons of dinosaur footprints, but they don't have much in the way of body fossils. The real dinosaur body fossil record comes from north of the Arctic Circle. And so I'm just going to talk about a few of the kinds of animals that have been found up there. Maybe I'll concentrate on four that we're most familiar with here in our collections here at the Perot. Okay, so where are all these things found? Well, it turns out most of the dinosaur fossils on the North Slope of Alaska come from one small stretch of river along the Colville River along the North Slope. And that is actually, most of them are actually known from, our best fossils are known from a couple of quarries, places called the Liscum Bone Bed Site and the Kikak-Tagosiak Quarry Site. These are a long way from here. I don't think a lot of people appreciate how far away this is, how far north these sites actually are. It turns out to the Kikak-Tagosiak Quarry to Salt Lake City is over 2,400 miles, or around 3,900 kilometers, give or take a little bit. It's only 1,000 miles from Salt Lake City to Dallas, where I'm standing right now. So we're talking about some incredible distances here that a lot of people don't appreciate. So this is also right around 69, almost 70 degrees north latitude, again, well above the Arctic Circle. And back in the Cretaceous, around 68.5 to 70 million years ago, when these animals were alive, that part of Alaska was even further north than it is today. The continent has drifted slightly southward since the time these animals lived. So these were truly polar dinosaurs. They lived in an incredibly odd environment, a setting which has no modern analogs. Right? This isn't a place where you had extreme seasonality. It's many months of complete sunlight. The sun never set. The midnight sun. Also, though, extremely long periods of time when the sun wouldn't rise, or at best it only ever got to slight twilight conditions. That's the way conditions are on the North Slope today, but if you look at what sort of environment, the temperatures, the plant life, things like that are there today, you have tundra. You do not have trees growing up tall, anything like that. But back in the day, we know for a fact it was much warmer. We're talking about conditions more like temperature-wise, like you'd expect around Portland, Oregon, maybe Vancouver, Canada, places like that along that part of the Pacific coast, where you had decent summers and cool winters, sometimes getting down to freezing or below. Probably not for extended stretches of time. You didn't see blizzards and things like that too often, I bet, but definitely cold enough to be uncomfortable. But yet you still had trees. We have a lot of plant fossils from these deposits. In fact, from this quarry, the Kikak-Tagosiak Quarry, as we're prepping dinosaur bones out, we oftentimes find lots of pieces of petrified wood, carbonized wood, lots of bits and pieces of carbonized plant fragments in there. So it was a lush place with a decent amount of rainfall too. So here we have an odd environment where you have darkness for long stretches of the year, light for long stretches of the year, plenty of trees, plenty of vegetation, and pretty good amount of moisture. That doesn't exist anywhere on the planet today. And so what we're trying to reconstruct is a world and the animals that live in that world in a place that we can't even wrap our brains fully around, understanding what sort of adaptations, what sort of selective pressures were pushing the evolution of these animals in this odd environment. Also, the North Slope was a pretty isolated place back then. Now, North America in the late Cretaceous had pretty much been split in two by a large intercontinental seaway that stretched from the modern-day Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, and it divided North America into a western and eastern landmass. This part of Alaska is on the western landmass, Laramidia, along with Utah and parts of West Texas, all the way down to New Mexico, Colorado, West Texas, Wyoming, the Dakotas to the north, parts of Alberta, formed a narrow strip of a continent called Laramidia. These animals lived on the extreme northernmost edge of that continent, that subcontinent of Laramidia. But in addition to that, there had been some tectonic activity that had occurred at this time and continued for a while, which caused the rise of the Brooks Range to the south of where these animals lived, which pretty much created a mountain chain that would have been as large and jagged and formidable as, say, the Tetons are today, except much, much, much longer, completely isolating, or nearly isolating, this region from the rest of North America. And this is a big area. Looks small on a map if you don't understand the scale, but that area of the North Slope north of the Brooks Range is actually about 2.5, not quite 3 times the size of Utah. And so this is a huge area that these animals inhabited under these extremely weird conditions. And these mountains would have formed a bit of a barrier to easy back and forth transport and travel between the dinosaurs that lived there and the dinosaurs that lived further south in Laramidia. So who lived there? Well, some of the very first dinosaur fossils that were found in Alaska and identified as actually dinosaur fossils were from a place called the Liscum Quarry. Now, the Liscum Quarry is completely dominated by the bones, thousands and thousands of bones of young juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs. And we have quite a collection of these here at the Perot Museum. And what's interesting, these animals, who they are, how they've been identified, what species that have been identified as, has been a little bit problematic because they're all juveniles. It's really hard to assign a baby, a youngster of a particular duck-billed dinosaur species, to an adult if we don't have any other babies of a known growth range of that adult species, that well-known adult species, to compare it to. And so some people have suggested that these things are actually members of previously named duckbills called Nanuqsaurus, perhaps one of the already named species, Nanuqsaurus annectans or Nanuqsaurus regalis. But others have proposed that no, this is a different species, perhaps even a different genus. Some recent studies by more than one paper have suggested now there really isn't enough justification for calling it a distinct genus. Perhaps it's different enough from its friends to the south, its relatives to the south, to consider a different species. But for right now, I'm going to refer to it as Edmontosaurus. Now, we have layers of bone beds from the Liscum site along the Colville River there that shows you, man, these things are getting wiped out frequently. I mean, it wasn't just one layer. Turns out there are stacked layers of bone beds in that region. And these are mass death assemblages. And people have wondered, man, what in the heck would wipe out so many young, juvenile Edmontosaurus, duck-billed dinosaurs up there? And it might have to do with that big mountain range to the south, the ancestral Brooks Range rising up. There would have been a snowpack formed on those high mountains every winter. And in the spring, you'd have a spring thaw, and you would have water rushing down across this coastal plain, spreading north towards the Arctic Ocean. And perhaps every now and then you got an exceptionally heavy snowpack. Perhaps it was a little too much water rushing down slope there. Could have caused conditions where you flooded out the lowlands along the periphery of the Arctic Ocean there, drowning out pretty much anyone who couldn't keep their head above water, and which would have have a lot of mortality, a lot of death of small individuals. And so that's an idea that's been thrown out there. These duck-billed dinosaurs were living and thriving in this wonderful environment north of the Arctic Circle. But every now and then you had a really bad spring where water came rushing on down, just flood everything, and many, if not most, of the youngsters in the population simply drowned. Once their carcasses had been exposed and water levels had gone down, you'd have bodies of these things stranded all over the place, which would attract predators and scavengers. Basically, you're just ringing the dinner bell. That's another kind of animal we find on the Colville River, somebody who was eating the juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs. Mixed in with a lot of the Liscum fossils, we actually get lots of teeth of troodontid dinosaurs. And it turns out troodontids are big-brained, big-eyed, pretty lightweight, lightly built animals, very bird-like skulls, body anatomy, things like that, predatory animals. They're really rare pretty much everywhere else in North America. If you take a look at the fossil record, you look at shed teeth and body parts and things like that that you find all the way from parts of Canada all the way to the south towards Texas. Troodontids are a rare part of the fossil record compared to the other meat-eating dinosaurs. However, up here in Alaska, on the North Slope, when you tally up the number of teeth you find and bits and pieces and potential body parts, oddly, the Troodontids outnumber everybody else on the meat-eating dinosaur counts. You find more of their teeth than anybody else's, by far. So it means perhaps Troodon up here, or Troodontids, I take that back, Troodontids, were the most common predator you're going to find up in the dinosaur communities of the North Slope. Another unusual thing about these Troodontids is that the teeth are unusually large. Most of the Troodontids are pretty small animals, we're talking large turkey, large dogs, in body mass and weight and things like that. Some of them perhaps about human-sized or darn near. But the ones on the North Slope, the teeth are almost twice the size of most Troodontids known from Asia and North America. So that implies one of two things. Either Troodontids on the North Slope of Alaska, 68 to 70 million years ago, had ridiculously large teeth in the same size bodies, or these teeth are actually the same proportional size as they are in other Troodontids, which means the whole Troodonid was nearly twice as big as you get down south. So a very odd situation happening here. We find a few body fossils, but not enough to really lock down many of the details about what the Troodontids up there, other than they were big, and there were a lot of them. Why would there be a lot of them? Well, that's a question. You think about their anatomy a little bit. I said they were big-eyed. If you take a look at the skull of a Troodonid, they have whopping big eyes compared to the rest of their body. So there's an animal that probably, if you have large eyes, means you have pretty good chance of being able to see pretty well in the dark or twilight condition. Well, what do you have on the North Slope for half the year? You have dark or twilight conditions. And so perhaps, and this is very speculative, perhaps we have a situation here where Troodontids had an advantage over most of the other animals of the predatory dinosaurs around because they already had whopping big eyes. They were well adapted for life in those dim to dark conditions that you're going to find on the North Slope. So that's an interesting thing there. Now let's move a few miles up the Colville, or down, a few miles down Colville River to another fossil locality, the Tykoski Quarry. This one here is a site that has produced a couple of dozen, at least, Pachyrhinosaurus specimens. And what is Pachyrhinosaurus? Pachyrhinosaurus is a ceratopsian, one of the horned dinosaurs, things like Triceratops, Utaceratops, Centrosaurus, any one of Styracosaurus, any one of a number of different species of these animals, all known for generally having great large frills in the back of the neck. A lot of them have large nose horns or brow horns and decorations like that on and around the face. However, Pachyrhinosaurus is a little bit odd. His first name, first species name was Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis from southern Alberta, and the name means thick-nosed reptile. And that's because instead of having big brow horns over the eyes or a big horn on the nose, instead it had a huge expanded boss, a big bulging mass of bone on top of its snout instead of horns. And also had big bulging masses, big bosses over top of the eyes instead of horns over the eyes. And it did have a frill like other ceratopsians, and those frills had various horns and protrusions and things on it. But instead of horns, they just had a face built like a battering ram. And these are very, in my book, probably very ugly animals. Just big masses of gnarly, hornified tissue building up on their faces all over. Well, that's all fine and good. Originally, Pachyrhinosaurus was named in 1950. In 2008, additional Pachyrhinosaurus, a second species, was named from further north in Alberta. That was Pachyrhinosaurus lacusti. And these animals formed much of our mental picture of what Pachyrhinosaurus looked like for a long time. But many years ago, a Pachyrhinosaurus-like skull was found on the Colville River way up north in a place called Ocean Point, and so on the Colville. And so we knew these animals were out there, but that specimen is at the University of California at Berkeley in their collections, has been for many years. Exploration along the Colville River back in the late 90s, early 2000s uncovered another locality along the Colville that produced lots and lots and lots of Pachyrhinosaurus material. And you're looking at a piece of it, this big thing I've been resting my hands on here, this big lumpy mass is actually a very recently prepped out partial skull, partial snout and face of one of the Pachyrhinosauruses from that quarry. And to get you oriented here, this is that massive nasal boss. You're looking at it from the side. The top side, I'd like to flip this over, but it's really heavy and I don't want to do that. Top side looks like a moonscape, looks like honeycombs, and just bumps and ridges and things like that. What you expect to find underneath a big horny boss on top of the face. These big ridges coming up the side show you the direction of growth, kind of like fingernail material, starting from the cuticle, which would be way down here, and growing upward onto the face. The eye would actually be about where my fist is, way back here. The tip of the nose is actually missing. It's broken off. I actually have it. We found it pieced together from about a dozen pieces here. That would actually be out here in space somewhere, about in this area. Now, most horned dinosaurs have a very sharp parrot-like beak on the tip of their snout. And that's one of the things that threw us off when we started finding lots of these Pachyrhinosaurus specimens from this quarry. Time after time, we kept finding the skulls and we couldn't find a sharp parrot-like beak on these animals. Instead, they have a very blunt, rounded, and strangely upturned, upward-facing, displaced sort of dull beak. Very unusual for horned dinosaurs. Man, if you take a look at most of them, they've got a big, sharp, parrot-like, pointy sort of beak. This one species of ceratopsian, here Pachyrhinosaurus, was different from all the others. And there are a few other anatomical differences here between this Pachyrhinosaurus from the north slope of Alaska and the other ones from further south. And it was for those reasons we were able to study this sample from this quarry and realize there were probably enough differences here between these animals and the southern versions to warrant calling this a different species. And so back around 2011, 2012, we named this one Pachyrhinosaurus peroorum, after the Perot family here in Dallas, Texas. And so we have a wonderful reconstruction of the skeleton of this animal on exhibit in our galleries. And one of the actual skulls, which was broken into about 1,000 pieces when we first found it and took it out of the block, and took about 4 years for me to prep and put all back together like the world's worst jigsaw puzzle. But you can see that specimen mounted there in the museum today. We now have, we're probably going on at least 10 partial skulls of this animal in our collections here at the Perot Museum, and there are others at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that also came from this site. And so a number of papers have been published on this. We're getting a decent picture of what this animal looked like and starting to learn a few things about its internal anatomy and physiology and things like that. So Pachyrhinosaurus is rapidly becoming one of our best understood ceratopsians. And so these animals were wandering around in large herds. You got a deathbed here, an assemblage, a quarry with at least 10 or 12 or 15 of these animals represented. You're looking at a herd of animals that died, or at least part of a herd that died and all washed in one space on a floodplain. Well, much like the Liscum quarry, where you had baby duckbills, you have a bunch of meat laying around in the natural world that's going to attract somebody who eats meat. And interestingly, from the same quarry, we found parts of one of those animals that would have probably been eating these Pachyrhinosauruses. Actually, I found a tooth of one of these animals, a tyrannosaurid tooth, actually stuck to the side of the skull, the one on exhibit in our building there. I managed to prep that off and took a look at that. So we knew there were tyrannosaurs wandering around up there, probably eating these Pachyrhinosauruses in this quarry. Eventually, we found in some isolated chunks and blocks, like you see scattered around here, pieces of one that had, these pieces had all been thrown in the same bucket because they were all from about the same spot, about probably no bigger than the size of this cart I'm standing in front of. And eventually, you notice that these bones were not Pachyrhinosaurus, and then we saw, hey, there's a part of a jaw in here. Well, that's definitely not a Pachyrhinosaurus jaw. You can see pointy teeth and tooth sockets that were only present in meat-eating dinosaurs. And so we originally thought that these were probably the remains of a previously known tyrannosaur. We actually thought probably something like Albertosaurus at the time. Eventually, though, we found enough pieces of this tyrannosaur that the anatomy didn't match Albertosaurus nor other tyrannosaurs that were known from this time, around 68, 69, maybe 70 million years ago. Now, there were anatomical differences. And plus, we talked to other experts on Tyrannosaurs and showed them some of the anatomical details. And one of these guys pointed out to us that there were signs that this was a relatively mature animal, which really surprised us because this was a really small chunk of jaw. And then we found part of the brain case and part of the face. And after going through the process of trying to say, well, is it Tyrannosaurus rex? Well, no, it's the wrong age, it's too small. Is it Despletosaurus? No, that's not it. Is it this one? Is it Albertosaurus? Is it Gorgosaurus or Albertosaurus libratus? We exhausted all the possibilities of whether or not these Tyrannosaur pieces could be assigned to a known Tyrannosaur, and they couldn't be. So, a few years ago, we anointed a new Tyrannosaur that lived on the north slope of Alaska, Nanuqsaurus hoaglandi. And weird thing is, it's sort of a runt. Okay, this is not a big animal. We have a reconstruction of a skeleton on exhibit in our building where it's standing on top of our prep lab, looking like it's about to leap down on you or leap down on the baby duckbill dinosaur skeleton across the aisle from it. But it's just not that big. And if that is an adult animal, you're talking about a Tyrannosaur that's less than half the length of more famous Tyrannosaurus rex and a heck of a lot lighter. And so, yeah, we named that thing Nanuqsaurus, which means polar bear reptile, and hoaglandi after Forrest Hoagland, a benefactor here at the museum. And so, this is strange. We have a pint-sized Tyrannosaur living and hunting and eating things like Pachyrhinosaurus in the north slope of Alaska at this time. This brought up a lot of questions for us, and so one of the things we thought about was like, why? Why would Tyrannosaurs, which are hugely successful up and down throughout Laramidia and into Asia, but generally are known for being some of the largest, most massive apex predators in their communities, why would we have a pint-sized Tyrannosaur in this place? And then we started thinking about it, and it dawned on us, perhaps again, you're looking at the conditions, these unusual Arctic conditions in Alaska, on the North Slope, that were giving pressures on these animals to evolve in particular ways, to adapt to this unusual environment. I mentioned before, you had the Troodonids, very big eyes. Hey, great for living in the dark. And that those Troodonids were getting larger. They were getting bigger because they had a huge advantage over everybody else, right? What if the Tyrannosaur, maybe at this environment with these long periods of darkness, which probably limited resources to some degree, what if that meant that a big Tyrannosaur couldn't survive, couldn't be successful in this environment, but smaller-bodied individuals who needed less food, less water, fewer resources, perhaps they had a selective advantage in this odd environment. And so perhaps over many generations in this relatively isolated part of Laramidia, perhaps there was a selective advantage for these super apex predators to become a little less super, a little smaller, and therefore be able to still occupy that apex predator role, just not in as large a package. That's sort of speculative, but you see precedent for this in isolated island communities where organisms that were small can become large, their descendants become large, and big animals on isolated environments like that can wind up shrinking down over many generations. There's precedent for it biologically. We haven't been able to really test it yet, but it's an idea we're throwing out there. So anyway, those are just a few of the dinosaurs we have a decent fossil record for up here in this Arctic region of Alaska. It's these polar dinosaurs that lived under the midnight sun. But really, that's just the slightest little glimpse of what was available out there. Who actually lived there? I mean, I just rattled off just 4 dinosaurs. There had to be so many more. But we have so little information because we have almost no localities in this region. An area almost 3 times the size of Utah. And all of the dinosaur body fossil sites that we have in this region are known from the stretch of the Colville that really is only around 50 miles in length. I mean, that's like, for those of you in Utah, that's about the same distance as if you were going up and down I-15, Interstate 15, from Salt Lake City south to around Payson, Utah or so. So imagine if your entire fossil record for this entire dinosaur fossil record for the state of Utah was only known from, say, along a 50-mile stretch of I-15, and you couldn't go off the highway more than 100 or 200 yards on either side of that interstate. And the only dinosaurs you knew of for the state of Utah had to come from that narrow strip along one interstate. Utah has an incredible dinosaur fossil record from all over the state. It's one of the richest dinosaur records known in the world. But imagine if you had to erase all that and you could only know about the dinosaurs from a tiny strip of territory, just a couple of 100 yards wide and 50 miles long. That's what we're dealing with trying to reconstruct the polar world of Alaska in the late Cretaceous. And so, obviously, I suspect there's a lot more out there to be found. It's a really ridiculously difficult place to work. And so that's one of the big limiting factors is just getting there, just operating there and finding exposures in those limited places. It's a tough, tough place. So, you know what? If somebody gets really adventurous and they want to go out and strike out into some other parts of Alaska and find some other exposures, I have no doubt that it wouldn't take them very long if they found a fossiliferous site. We'd be hearing about all sorts of brand new dinosaurs from Alaska, from the Arctic, the polar dinosaurs of Alaska. And I hope that we do at some point, because we've just scratched the surface with just a few of the fossils, just a few sites. And we have no idea what else could be waiting for us there, but it's going to be interesting to find out. So with that, I thank you for your time. I hope I've been able to tell you a little bit about some animals you might not have heard too much about before. And I thank you again, and have a wonderful day.